Summary of last week. What did we learn about last week? It was a few days ago now, but can I remember? It was chapter 4, Cain and Abel, right. Okay, so we learned about Cain and Abel. Before that, we learnt about Adam and Eve, and before that, the creation. But the themes that we've seen already within scriptures continues in today's section. Because through scripture, there are themes which start, and although they may not seemingly flow through to the next chapters and books and the New Testament, when you actually study it, you can see that God has placed the foundation of this salvation of this world right from the beginning, and that flows through the whole of Scripture. So although what we're going to do today is to look at the flood, we can perhaps think that this was a distinctly different story, but actually if you underpin it with what we've thought about over the past few weeks, you can see the themes continuing through the story. Now, a lot of these stories and passages that we can read from the early chapters in Genesis, we may know them in terms of what happened in the story. So we may know of what happened with Adam and Eve, we may know what happened with Cain and Abel, but only when we start studying it, and we've obviously only touched on some of the aspects over the past few weeks, when you start studying it with the context of what we've already thought about, it kind of brings perhaps a new meaning to the stories. And hopefully we'll see that as we continue through this evening. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at the division of the Earth's population. We're going to look at the result of the mixing of the two different communities. We're going to look at the promised destruction of the population, which is God's response to the wickedness that he saw in the world. But there was one exception, and that exception was Noah. And God gave him some instructions to avoid that destruction. We'll look at the flood and some of its outcomes. We'll also look at some of the archaeological evidence that's around, and then we'll look at the wider significance of the flood. Okay, so as I mentioned, the themes that we've looked at already, and the passages that we looked at already, and in particular, Cain and Abel from last week. So as we know, there was these two brothers, one who did what God wanted him to do, and one who did what he wanted to do himself. And we know what happened as a result of those two paths. We saw that one was killed and the other was banished to another land. But then there was another son, and there were many sons and daughters, as we're going to read, but there's one particular that we can read of. So let's just open our Bibles then. And we started, didn't we, last week in chapter 4 of Genesis. And if we just for continuity's sake, let's just go in at Genesis chapter 4, verse 24. It says, "If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold." So we see here that the generations that have continued and the family tree has grown. It says then in verse 25, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth. For God said, She hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, who Cain slew. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. And began men to call upon the name of the Lord." Okay, then, so we got then this one brother who we know, didn't we, from last week, that was sent off to another place to live. And then we see that Seth was born. And we can see here that these descendants of Seth and Cain developed into two different communities. It says there, "Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord." So it can say also be rendered in a translation to call in the name of the Lord. So we see then the suggestion that these were the sons of God. But we see also in chapter, so where are we? Chapter 4, verse 26. It says, "Or call themselves by the name of the Lord." You can see that in your margin. But it came to pass then in chapter 6 and verse 1 and 2. So let's just read that. Because in chapter 5 it talks about the genealogies. So chapter 6 is when the next story that we'll look at today comes in. So chapter 6 verse 1 and 2. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and took them wives of all which they chose. Okay, so we've then got these two groups of people. We've got the sons of God, or those who call themselves in the name of the Lord, and then we've got the sons and daughters of men. And what happened then was the result of this mixing. Because we saw then in verse 2, didn't we, where it says that they saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them as wives. So they were mixing these two groups, the sons of men and the sons of God. So what then was the result of this mixing? Now just keep in context what we learnt about last week of those who did what God asked them to do and those who did what they wanted themselves to do. Okay? The result of that mixing then was, we can see in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And verse 11, and the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all the flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. It says, and God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence. So we see then, the result of this mixing was that those who followed God and those who followed after their own lusts and did what they wanted to do, you put them together, and what happens? Question.
They breed bad people.
Right. So there's an example, that's exactly right, there's an example in the New Testament which tells us exactly this. I think is it on the screen? Yeah, so in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 9, we won't look it up because it's just a few words, but in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 9 it says, a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. So this concept then of cooking or baking, you put a little bit of leaven and it leavens all of it. So if you put a group of righteous people and put a few people in who want to do what they want to do, what happens? The result of that mixing is that, like the bad apple, I guess, in the fruit bowl, what happens? It spreads to the others. It doesn't get consumed by the goodness, it's the other way around. And this is what happened in the time of Noah, where there was these two groups of people, you mix them, and what happens? And we've got a nice picture then of a loaf of bread. You know, it leavened all of it. So this is what happened over the years. These two groups resulted in mixing, and that result of that mixing meant that God saw that the world was corrupt and that it was filled with violence. But there was one exception. So we read then in Genesis 6, if you're with me, Genesis 6 and verse 8 and 9. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And it says, Noah, in verse 9, was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. So even though there were these two groups, those who wanted to follow God and those who wanted to follow after their own ways, after that mixing, that was basically filled with violence, there was this one exception, this man Noah. And even though around him there was all this destruction and violence, Noah still wanted to do what God asked him to do. So God gave a time limit to the wickedness of man. It was 120 years, and for most of this time, we can imagine, can't we, as we know that Noah was righteous, that he would have tried to persuade or preach to those around him that they should still follow God. But as we know, through this story, that there were none others who would change their ways. In 2 Peter 2 verse 5 it says, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah in the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. So even though God saw that the world was wicked, even though there was that one man who followed God's ways, God still created a way, a mechanism, a process in which the righteous can be saved. So it wasn't just that God said, look at the world, it's a mess, let's just start again. He still gave a way for the righteous to be saved. He still gave that way of salvation. And that's, something which we perhaps can reflect on in our own lives as we see in the world around us. That as the world is still now filled with violence, there is still a way of salvation for us. So it says that there were 8th person. Do we know why there were 8?
Let's try and work it out. Adam and Eve, Cain, Abel, Seth.
Not quite. Next generation down, or a few generations down. So you got then, if you just have a look at your Bible in verse 10, you've got your answer.
Just about to write that down.
It's 3 sons.
It's got 3 sons. So it's
Ham and Japheth.
right. So we got Noah. Let's go for Mrs. Noah, because we don't know what it's called. Had 3 sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth. They each had a wife.
7.
They each had a wife.
Makes him 8.
He's the 8th, correct. So then when we look at this verse in 2 Peter 2 verse 5, where it says the 8th person, it's because he's got his 3 sons, their wives, his wife, and Noah the 8th. Does that make sense? Now, does anyone know what 8 means in the Bible? Or is a symbol of? So in Scripture, 8 is a symbol of new beginnings. So we think about the days of the week. You've got a full 7 days of the week. The 8th day is like the beginning of the next week. So it's a symbol of new beginnings, which, if we know the story of Noah before we get to it, we can see why that's a symbol for us there. Okay. So what did Noah have to do? So this is then God saying that there is a way to be saved. It says, I'm going to destroy the earth. What it says then in verse 14, let's just read this. So verse 14 of chapter 6. So this is God saying to Noah, make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms thou shalt make in the ark, and thou shalt pitch it within and without the pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The ark, the length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, and the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window thou shalt make to the ark, and a cubit thou shalt finish it above. And the door of the ark thou shalt set in the side thereof, with lower and second and third stories shalt thou make it. So God said, make an ark. It talks about the pitch. Do you know what the pitch is? It's like a tar. Yeah, so basically make it watertight. So you've made the structure and you make it watertight. There are, symbols that we can go into, which we perhaps can look at later if there's time. However, what we're then told is he's going to make an ark. We're told the length of it is 300 cubits, the breadth 50 cubits, the height 30 cubits. There's going to be a window, there's going to be a door, and there's going to be different stories within it, 3 stories within the ark. Okay? So, it's roughly about 172 metres long by 29 metres wide by 17 high. Okay, so it's large. I won't go through all of this, but it says 1,000 rail freight carriages could load such a vessel. So, what happened? Let's just quickly scan through some of these, because I think there's quite a lot we're going to get through this evening. So, there was 7 days warning before the rain was going to come into the earth. Now, it hadn't rained before this time. We talk about the firmament coming down. We had a chat about this last week. The firmament came down and watered the ground and went back up. They hadn't seen rain.
Yeah.
Now, for God to say to Noah, build this boat, I would suggest to you, and this is not a scriptural statement, which, I get shot down for this, I suspect he's probably done this near some form of forest, is my suggestion. Probably didn't do it near a lake because there wouldn't be any trees there. If you're going to build a boat of this size, it's going to be somewhere near a wood or a forest. I'd suggest to you where you got the timber from. That's my suggestion. Don't know. The reason I say it's probably near a forest, is the fact they hadn't seen any rain. The only boats that they would have had would be to go on lakes and such things. Building a boat of this size, you wouldn't be able to move it to a lake or a river or a sea. So there would have been some faith, I think, for Noah to build such a big boat that he wouldn't know how to move to water, having never seen rain. Now God has said, do this thing, and he's just gone and done it. Now, why I mention all of that was it says that he was in the ark for 7 days before it rained. Now, for a man who spent so many years building a boat, he's then been called into the boat after the animals are in there to be in the boat. God closes the door, and then nothing happens for 7 days. I think there's also some faith there as well. God said it's going to rain, build this boat, come into it. For 7 days, that's quite a long time. Feels like a long time ago since we were here last week. But that's just 7 days ago. And he was in this ark with these animals. It's not raining. Okay, so we read then, didn't we, verse 1 of chapter 7, that Noah and his family were sealed in the ark. Okay? Then it rained for 40 days. We saw that in verse 4, didn't we? And I will cause the rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, we see then in there's a bit of a summary down to verse 10, then it goes through it again in verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, and in the 2nd month and the 17th day of the month, this same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. So it started raining, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. It then reiterates who was in the ark in verse 13. The self-same day entered Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth and the sons of Noah and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of the sons with them into the ark. So it kind of reiterates who those 8 were. Okay? So, we then read that the waters prevailed upon the earth in verse 18.
Shut him in, verse 16. The Lord shut him in.
Yes.
So that's important.
So it wasn't the fact that Noah closed the door, it was God who closed it behind them. Okay? He then says that the waters covered the mountaintops and all flesh died, apart from obviously those that were in the ark. We see that in verse 20 and 21.
How about the fish?
The fish were fine.
Fish were fine.
Fish were fine. Because it doesn't say...
Fish lived in the water.
Yeah, it doesn't say anything. It just says the beasts of the earth, the creeping thing, the cattle and the fowl. It doesn't say anything about the fish. Now, interestingly, there are other passages in the prophets where it talks about all the creation and basically undoing God's creation, including the fish. Obviously, in here, the fish were fine. In fact, they were probably quite happy. They had lots more.
Yeah.
More places to swim, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Okay, so this lasted then for 150 days. So why is it 150 days? It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. That's obviously not 150 days. So why do we see this 150 days? Any ideas?
To make sure that the earth is flooded to the mountain tops and all the evil giants and genetically corrupted people are killed.
That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is you fill up the sink, takes 30 seconds? Takes a lot longer to go back down, unless you obviously pull the plug. Yeah, so the water prevailed on the earth. It wasn't just that it stopped raining at 40 days and it was all good. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights, but it obviously took a lot longer for it to subside.
In 7:20 it says the waters prevailed 15 cubits upwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's at its height.
that's in its height.
Yeah. What we're not told about is what the earth was like. It talks about then the, where does it say it?
It would take years, ages for it to soak into the ground.
Exactly. So the high hills, the world changed at this point. The fountains of the deep came up. The whole structure of the world would have been changed.
It's got nothing
The
to do
earth,
with
the
15
earth.
cubits, and it just so happens that that's 15.
So over time, the water obviously would drop. Top of the mountains would be the first thing you would see. Bearing in mind, remember there was a window, high up window. In chapter 8, verse 4, and the ark rested on the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. Okay, so the waters subside, and obviously the mountains are obviously the first thing you would see. After then another 40 days, the window was open, and a raven and a dove were sent out, but there was nowhere suitable for them to stay. And we can read that in verses 6 to 9. I'm going to try and skip through some of this. So
They
we
came
can-
back, they returned to the ark.
that's right, because there was nowhere
Verse 9.
for them to stay.
Verse 9, they returned. She returned to the ark.
After another 7 days, another dove, which was sent out, returned with an olive leaf.
Ah.
And then 7 days later, it didn't return at all. So you can see the progression then from the birds were coming back, the bird came back with a twig, bird didn't come back. Okay, so you can see the progression, and you can see what Noah was thinking. Again, there is a symbol between these two birds. So the first one was a raven that was sent. And what's a raven do? It's a scavenger, right? So it could find stuff to eat, probably. Yeah, it wouldn't have been nice stuff. We probably wouldn't want it. The dove didn't like what it saw, came back. Only when it could actually feed itself, I guess, and find somewhere to lodge would it then not come back. So you see the differences then almost of the raven and the dove in terms of what type of animal they were and what it likes to eat. And there are numerous more symbols behind that, but we haven't got time this evening to go through that. Okay, so where we get to then verse 13, and it came to pass, so chapter 8, verse 13, it came to pass in the 601st year and the first month and the first day of the month, the waters dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. So after all of this building of the ark, after this period of time where he waited in the ark, after the rain, seeing all the, well, he wouldn't have seen the destruction because it was in the ark, but all the destruction that went on around him, waiting, all that time for the water to subside, they land on a mountain, the birds don't come back, and then there's dry ground. So we can see then kind of the cleanness of what the earth would have been like.
So it's 13 months that the earth was flooded then. 13 months.
Well, let's walk this through then. So what year was it that he went in to the ark?
600.
600th year, yep. So that was in chapter 7 and verse 11. So, and then what do we get to in chapter 8, verse 13? What do we read? 601st year and first month and the first day of the month. Yeah. Okay, so you got your 13 months. A long time, isn't it, to be in a boat?
Yeah.
So what happens at the end of that then? Chapter 8, verse 14, and in the second month, so in fact, it went on another month, didn't it? Yeah, so it wasn't just that it was 30 months, he was there for another month. And it's on the 20th day of the 27th day of the second month that the earth was dried. So it was actually 14 months total. Okay, so verse 14, and God spoke to Noah, go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife and thy sons wives with thee, and bring forth thee every creature and living thing of all the flesh, both fowl or cattle or creeping thing that creep on the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth. Okay, so out they come. Verse 20, what did Noah then do? He built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean beast and every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So basically he praised God at the end of it. He recognised it was God who saved him. He recognised the fact that it was a miracle that he would have been saved, with all the animals and the boat that he'd been told to build through rain, which he'd never seen. It would have been quite a humbling time for Noah. And what was the result then of that? In verse 21, and the Lord smelled a sweet savour, and the Lord said unto his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite any more every living thing, or everything living as I have done. Okay.
Time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night shall not cease. 22.
So after what God said to Noah, what else do we know of this story? So let's just look at chapter 9.
The climate was different before the flood to after the flood. We get
That's
seed
true.
time and harvest after the flood,
Indeed.
whereas before the flood a mist came up and watered the earth.
And what was the
They
covenant?
They didn't have rain.
They didn't have rain before, no? Exactly. So the atmosphere would have been different as well, I guess. But what did God say? He said in verse 12 of chapter 9, "This is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that's with you for perpetual generations. I will set my bow or rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of the covenant between me and the earth. And when it shall come to pass, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant between me and you." Okay, so this covenant now, as God said, I will put this rainbow in the sky, so every time I see this, I will remember my covenant that I won't flood the earth. Now, bearing in mind, before there had been no rain, and we know through physics how you get a rainbow. You have sunlight and you have rain. Before that, they wouldn't have seen a rainbow. Whereas after, they didn't have the rain. Okay,
And there was supposedly this canopy, this vapour canopy,
the firmament, yeah.
surrounding the earth, and the climate, it has been argued by some, was equitable. We didn't have ice at the poles.
Could be.
That's another subject.
Indeed. Right, Dave, over to you.
Yes, David. So we're picking up then on verse on page 47 of the notes. So the sort of headings that we're up to was the flood and Noah's escape feasible? So all these things that we've been considering, obviously we've considered the literal facts as they are stated in the scriptures. It's an extraordinary account, no one can deny. But and some people may think that it's too extraordinary, we just can't believe that. Now there are various arguments that can be put forward as to whether the flood did cover the whole world or whether the flood was just a localised flood. I think there are reasonable arguments for both. There's various questions are being asked. Well, if it was not a worldwide flood, why did Noah have to build the ark? He could have walked somewhere to safety in 120 years that it took him to prepare it. Why was it so big? The ark was huge. It was more than big enough to hold the animals of the local area in Mesopotamia where Noah was. It was big enough to hold all the animals in the world. I think that's been the two or the sevens. That's been proven. Why were birds sent on board? They could have flown away. All those sorts of questions as to why. An argument that it had to be a worldwide flood. But then on the other hand, I think there are arguments as well as to why it was local. Because the purpose of the flood ultimately was that God would destroy all flesh. Now, if mankind wasn't across the whole world, why would God need to flood the whole world? He only needed to flood the part where man was.
Animals would have spread. Even if people didn't, the animals would.
Yeah, again, we don't know how far, I suppose, but yeah.
It says back here something about everything that breathes.
Everything that was. Yeah, it did say.
Breathe.
All flesh died. Was it chapter 7, verse 21? All flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, cattle, beasts, and every creeping thing. But yeah. And the account also refers to, other than the rain, to these fountains of the deep being broken up. And you can read accounts. Well, you've got sea all around that area in the Middle East there. You've got to the north, the Black Sea. You've got to the east, the Caspian Sea. To the south, the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea. And then to the west, the Mediterranean Sea. So it is in this natural area where the waters could come in and down from above. So there's arguments, I think, as to it could be a localised flood, it could be a worldwide flood. But I think ultimately that doesn't matter because God was the creator of all things. He's ultimately powerful. He could do whatever he wants. And Jesus said of God, didn't he, that with God all things are possible. And that's, I think, what we need to bear in mind, that this account did happen because that's what God has recorded for us. The Bible's not supposed to be a science textbook that's got the answers to everything. It's got what God has intended us to know about his plan and purpose. And that's what he's told us. All the things that we've considered, that was the purpose of the flood. But just in terms of the evidence of a flood, there is some. So in the notes, we've got a section here on page 47. Famous British archaeologist Leonard Woolley. So he was working in Mesopotamia in 1929. He was investigating the tombs of the kings near the ancient town of in this area, and they found this peculiar sort of thing when they dug down these big pits, sunk shafts into the ground, and there was this layer, it's number 3 on here, this band of clay about 10 feet thick. So you've got items that were found above, and then just below that similar items being found, but then this almost unexplainable, except for there was a flood, big band of clay. You have all these silt deposits that would have been deposited as a result of this flood. So there is definitely evidence, archaeological evidence of the flood. We've then got this little section at the bottom of page 47 about the fact that there are accounts of a deluge in many cultures. So 33 separate accounts of the flood in cultural records. It's got a list of all the different countries, and it quotes here in the notes from the Polynesian record. The hero of the account is one called Nuru, and I think he had a wife called Lily Noe or something like that. Yeah, Lily Noe, on page 48. So, and the stories are similar, but obviously they have differences in the different cultures. And that strongly suggests, doesn't it, that there's this collection of accounts of this similar, or the same incident, but the accounts have lost accuracy.
No, this is other side of the world. This is Hawaii. So
that's right, yes.
Mount Mauna Kea in the island of Hawaii.
Yeah, so that's where the story is. But obviously they're all of a similar flood that took place. With,
Polynesian,
yeah. And so it suggests that it's a common, the story is from a common origin, this great flood that happened in Noah's day. But the events, or the story has got changed depending on how far it's spread and where it's sort of ended up, sort of thing. But they all come from the same account. So that's just a little bit of evidence, as it were, as to why it's feasible. But what we want to do really is move on to the wider significance of the flood and spend some time doing that. So in the notes, I just want to read this first sort of sentence or two under the wider significance of the flood, because we have a pattern in Noah's day that we see again, once or twice even, through time. So it says in the notes here, according to the Genesis record, the flood came on the earth because of the extreme growth of wickedness and godlessness, and because the earth was filled with violence. It says warnings were given and much time elapsed before the destruction ensued, and this was to set a pattern for the future. You read that? So wickedness and godlessness, we've seen that there's wickedness and godlessness, that's why the flood came upon the earth. Then there was these warnings given. We've considered how that Noah was this preacher of righteousness, so for 120 years potentially he was warning those that were mocking him for building this huge boat on dry ground with no rain. And then the judgment came and the outcome. And that was twofold, wasn't it? So the outcome of God's judgment was that the wicked were destroyed, but the faithful, like Noah and his family, they were saved in the ark. And that's an amazing pattern, as we hope to just quickly see as we just look through time, because that repeated. And so, as the notes continue to say, on page 48, this was a pattern for the future. And so in New Testament times, this pattern... So in New Testament times, so we've got this quote from 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 to 7. And we see this pattern really clearly, I think, in this passage. So let's just have a look at it. It's in the middle of page 48. So in verses 3 and 4 we see this sort of repeated pattern of wickedness and godlessness being in the world. So Peter wrote that knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers. This is the last days of the Jewish sort of days, the Jewish times. Scoffers walking after their own lusts and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. So there's this similar sort of thing, isn't it, to Noah's day, when men just wanted to please themselves. They weren't interested in God or anything else. So then there was a warning given, so verse 5 and 6. For this they were willingly ignorant of. They didn't want to listen to the warnings, they were ignorant. That by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So here's Peter quoting the flood. That this happened before, the warnings were given because of wickedness, and nobody listened. And it's happening again. And then verse 7 there in that quote. But the heavens and the earth which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. And so there you've got the judgment and the outcome again. And it all happened. It all happened in New Testament times. So Peter was warning that just as this happened in the days of Noah, there was this judgment and the people scoffed at Noah at that time. And the world, however, was destroyed by water, as God had said. He said it's going to happen again, and you'll be destroyed by fire this time. This was talking about the Jewish world in New Testament. But then, the third repeating of this pattern is the most significant, really, because it relates to us. So Jesus spoke of this repeating pattern of Noah's day, referring to the days that we live in now, because it's the days when he said he would return, the days of his second coming, and we know he's not here yet. So that's what's referred to in Matthew 24, verse 37 to 39. So this is on page 49 in the notes. So this is the repeating of the pattern again, as the wickedness, the godlessness that's in the world that would be judged. And so let's just read those words in Matthew 24. Jesus said, as the days of Noah were, so should also the coming of the Son of Man be. So clear reference to the days of Noah, this pattern that's repeating again. He said, for as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. And so we can see that a pattern in the wickedness that was in the earth in Noah's day, in our own days. There are three things that have been referred to, sort of self-reliance, and every imagination. We read, I wrote a little note down when we were reading it earlier, in Genesis 6 verse 5. God said that what was wicked in the earth was every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart, that it was evil. So there's this self-reliance. Man thinks that he can do everything, he can work his way out of everything. But it won't be the case, not when the judgments of God come. Referred also to the earth being filled with violence in Noah's day, and that's clearly a big feature, sadly, of our world in which we live today. And then in this passage that we've just read in Matthew 24, where Jesus is talking about the eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, it's lovers of pleasure, isn't it? People just want to please themselves and not follow God and be restricted in any way. And these are the things that Jesus is saying. Just like the days of Noah were, when the world is wicked like that, then that's when Jesus will return. And so it is that we're in that situation, and so we've received the warnings. And so we've got the passage in Romans chapter 2, quoted here in the notes. The Bible speaks of God judging the world again, that Christ will come to judge both Jews and Gentiles. So we've considered how in the first century there was clearly that pattern that repeated, and the Jews were destroyed and banished from their land, the city Jerusalem destroyed, but then also the Gentiles as well. So it's this pattern that's repeating now. And so in Romans 2, verse 6 to 9, that quote there, speaks of God who will render to every man according to his deeds. To them who by patient continuance in well-doing seek for glory and honour and immortality, he will render eternal life. But unto them that are contentious and do not obey the truth but obey unrighteousness, he will render indignation and wrath, tribulation and anguish upon every soul of man that doeth evil, of the Jew first, and also of the Gentile. But yeah, Paul said, didn't he, that God has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness. That's what's going to happen. And yeah, exactly what's in this passage, isn't it? That he'll render to every man according to his deeds. So yeah. But also, so we're thinking now about this second period, aren't we? So we've got the wickedness and godlessness, and so the warnings are given, and time elapsed. So just as in Noah's day, he preached for this 120 years, the people had an opportunity, a long opportunity, ample opportunity, to listen to the warnings, to turn to God and be saved. But they didn't, apart from the 8 in Noah's family. And it's the same now. The scriptures say that God is patient, he's long-suffering. He's patiently waiting that any that still will can turn to him from the wickedness that's in the world. But the third step is going to come. The judgment will come. So the scriptures they foretell the removal of the present order of things on the earth and their replacement by a divine institution headed by Christ. We could look at prophecies. We could, for instance, turn to Ezekiel 38, a chapter that speaks of the great judgment where God's going to completely destroy those that are opposed to him and his people. Talks about a judgment of natural causes, of fire and brimstone and hailstones, and that will destroy them, and just confusion amongst his enemies, turning upon themselves. So there will be this massive judgment upon the earth. In this sort of pattern in our day, so we've got this passage from 2 Peter 3 verse 13. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness. So the outcome of this judgment, because of the wickedness, for those that don't heed the warnings, is destruction. But also for those that do heed the warnings, like Noah and his family, there's a new heavens and a new earth. So the current dispensation that exists now, all this wickedness and godlessness will be removed, and a new heaven and earth will be established. Not literal heavens and earth, but a constitution of society, as it says in the notes there. Okay, our time is running away, so we've just got one more last bit to do. So it's on page 50. So just to think about the ark as being the vessel of salvation. So we've considered this pattern of the wickedness and the warnings, and time to heed the warnings before the judgment comes. So the ark now was this vessel of salvation, wasn't it, for Noah and his family? And it's an indicator as to how we should respond to the warnings of judgment today. So basically the outcome, as to whatever the outcome is going to be for us, as to whether we're in the camp of those like the wicked of Noah's day who were destroyed by the flood, or whether we're like the faithful few who boarded the ark and were saved by water. We also have an opportunity to be saved by water. But what we do now will depend on whether we are or not. So we need to be the few, like Noah and his family, who did listen to the warnings and act upon them. And that's really what, let's just read this quote from 2 Peter chapter 3, where it speaks about the salvation of Noah and his family being compared with our salvation through Christ and the waters of baptism. So 2 Peter 3 verse 18. For Christ also hath suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit. By which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison. That's referring to the people that were in bondage to sin. But yeah, so it's this marvellous thing, isn't it, that this pattern's repeated, and the very means of salvation for Noah. We have a similar salvation through water, and it corresponds to Christ. We've got this other quote. Yeah, there we go. So 1 Corinthians 15 verse 22. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. So Christ is our refuge. But as Noah was required to carefully follow the instructions in relation to the ark, we have to follow the instructions in relation to Christ. You got it? Yeah, 1 Peter 3. That one. So I realise we're rushing on a bit, but yeah, there's a lot in here, but our time is gone. But yeah, so just really to what we got up to now. So we were talking about this reference where in 1 Corinthians 15. So it's necessary, as Noah followed the instructions to be saved in the ark, so we need to follow the instruction as to how we are saved through Christ, which is by baptism. And as an example of baptism, in the notes here in Acts chapter 8, in the days of Paul, where an Ethiopian, Paul came across an Ethiopian, it wasn't Paul, it was Philip, came across an Ethiopian eunuch, and he explained to the Ethiopian what he was reading in the prophecy of Isaiah, because he wanted to know what he was reading. And once he'd understood essentially the gospel message, then he said, here's water, I want to be baptised, basically, and they went down into the water. So just in a little nutshell there, we see that belief is involved and full immersion in terms of baptism in water. And that's the process whereby we can escape the lot of man. So where everybody else who's in that wicked and godless camp, they're going to be destroyed because they don't heed the warnings. Whereas the few that do heed the warning and are baptised into Christ can be saved and can escape the end that's coming to the rest of humanity, as it were. So this reference here in 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 4 perhaps just summarises that we're given exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that's in the world through lust. So that's what we need to do, escape that corruption, and it's an escape on a par with...
The world is cosmos, that's cosmos in the Greek.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. One of the Greek words for the world.
Right, yeah. So many different topics we're touching on here, it's great, but yeah, it just shows the wealth of information there is in the scriptures, isn't there, and study that's available. Obviously we're trying to touch on things at quite a high level here to get through, but yeah, Noah escaped through the vessel of salvation, which was the ark. We need to escape God's coming judgments through water as well, through the waters of baptism. I think that's probably where we should leave it there.